23rd April, 1925. The morning sun cast long shadows across the sprawling Ford River Rouge complex in Dearborn, Michigan, as a distinguished visitor in Western attire stood motionless before the greatest industrial spectacle the world had ever witnessed. Commander Isoroku Yamamoto of the Imperial Japanese Navy watched with penetrating focus as molten steel flowed like rivers of fire, as assembly lines birthed automobiles with mechanical precision, as thousands of workers moved in choreographed efficiency that seemed almost military in its discipline. What he witnessed that spring morning would haunt him for the next 17 years, ultimately shaping his most dire prophecy about a war he never wanted to fight. Yamamoto had arrived in America not as a warrior but as a student. The Imperial Japanese Navy, recognizing his brilliant tactical mind and linguistic abilities, had assigned him to Harvard University in 1919 to study English and American culture. But the young naval officer's education extended far beyond Cambridge classrooms. He traveled extensively throughout the industrial heartland of America, and what he discovered there would fundamentally alter his understanding of modern warfare and national power. The factories of Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Cleveland weren't merely producing consumer goods. They were demonstrating an industrial capacity that could be rapidly converted to military production on a scale Japan could never hope to match. According to historical records preserved in the Naval War College archives, Yamamoto spent considerable time touring American automotive plants during his posting. Henry Ford's revolutionary assembly line techniques particularly fascinated him. At River Rouge, a single facility employed over 75,000 workers and produced complete automobiles from raw materials. Iron ore, coal, and rubber arrived at one end, finished vehicles emerged at the other. The complex had its own steel mill, glass factory, power plant, and even a railroad. Yamamoto understood immediately that this integrated production model could manufacture tanks, aircraft, and warships with equal efficiency. The commander's American sojourn revealed more than just industrial might. He witnessed a society that embraced technology, rewarded innovation, and possessed seemingly limitless natural resources. The United States produced more steel in a single year than Japan could manufacture in a decade. American oil fields pumped more petroleum in months than Japan's entire strategic reserves. The disparity wasn't merely significant, it was overwhelming, almost incomprehensible to military planners in Tokyo who had never witnessed such abundance firsthand. During evening discussions with fellow naval officers and American counterparts, Yamamoto often expressed his admiration for American productive capacity, though his praise carried an undercurrent of concern. Japan's military leadership spoke increasingly of confronting Western powers to secure resources and territory. But Yamamoto had seen what confrontation would truly mean. He had walked through factories that stretched beyond the horizon, watched as American workers operated machinery that multiplied human effort 1,000-fold, observed a culture that valued practical engineering over traditional military virtues. The Japanese naval officer was developing a reputation among his peers. He was becoming the man who understood America too well, who had seen the colossus that his countrymen could only imagine. 1931. The Manchurian incident exploded across headlines as Japanese forces seized control of northeastern China, marking the beginning of Japan's aggressive expansion across Asia. Back in Tokyo, now serving as a rear admiral, Yamamoto watched with growing apprehension as his nation embarked on a course he considered profoundly dangerous. The military factions that dominated Japanese politics had never toured Ford's factories, never stood before the blast furnaces of Pittsburgh, never calculated the true arithmetic of industrial warfare. They measured power in battleships and aircraft carriers, in the spirit of the samurai, in the willingness to sacrifice. Yamamoto measured it in tons of steel, barrels of oil, and manufacturing capacity per capita. The admiral's concern wasn't theoretical. Japan's entire industrial base, concentrated in a few vulnerable coastal cities, produced approximately 5 million tons of steel annually. The United States produced over 50 million tons. Japan imported 80% of its oil, mostly from American and Dutch sources. Its shipyards, though efficient, could construct perhaps 8 major warships annually under maximum production. America's shipyards, when converted to wartime operations, could launch that many vessels in weeks. These weren't pessimistic estimates. They were mathematical certainties that Yamamoto had calculated repeatedly, hoping each time that his arithmetic was somehow flawed. During this period, Yamamoto served as head of the Technical Division of the Naval Air Corps, where he championed the development of long-range naval aviation. He understood that Japan's only hope in any Pacific conflict would be delivering a devastating first strike that might buy time for negotiated peace. But he also understood that time would be brief. His experiences in Detroit had taught him that American factories, once mobilized for war production, would become an unstoppable industrial avalanche. The assembly lines that built Fords and Chevrolets would build bombers and tanks. The steel mills that supported skyscrapers would forge warships. The oil refineries that fueled American automobility would power entire fleets. References to Yamamoto's warnings during this period appear in multiple historical sources, including Gordon Prangya's comprehensive work on Pearl Harbor, which documents the admiral's increasing frustration with Japanese military planners who dismissed his concerns about American industrial capacity. He told colleagues repeatedly that Japan was contemplating a war it could not win, that striking America would awaken a sleeping giant whose productive capacity Japan could never overcome through military valor alone. By 1934, Yamamoto had been promoted to Vice Minister of the Navy, a position that gave him direct influence over naval policy and strategy. He used this platform to argue strenuously against confrontation with the United States, though his opposition was often misunderstood. Yamamoto wasn't a pacifist, he was a realist. He had commanded destroyers, studied naval tactics, and possessed the warrior spirit that defined the Imperial Japanese Navy. But he had also stood in the River Rouge complex and watched America's industrial heartbeat with a power that Japan simply could not match. His opposition to war wasn't based on weakness or lack of fighting spirit. It was based on mathematics, on production capacity, on the cold calculation of industrial might versus military tradition. The admiral's warnings grew more specific and more dire as the decade progressed, and Japan's relationship with Western powers deteriorated. 1937. As Japanese forces pushed deeper into China following the Marco Polo Bridge incident, Yamamoto's prophetic voice grew increasingly isolated within military circles. He had been appointed commander of the 1st Carrier Division, a position that placed him at the forefront of Japan's naval aviation development. Yet even as he drilled his pilots and refined carrier tactics, he continued warning anyone who would listen about the fundamental impossibility of defeating America in a prolonged conflict. His opposition wasn't merely strategic, it was existential. He had calculated the odds, and they were catastrophically against Japan. The admiral's famous warning, that Japan could run wild for 6 months to perhaps a year, but could guarantee nothing beyond that time frame, emerged during this period of escalating tensions. Historical accounts, including those documented by Japanese historians at the National Institute for Defense Studies in Tokyo, record Yamamoto making this statement multiple times in various forms during meetings with military and political leaders. The time frame wasn't arbitrary. It was based on his careful analysis of American industrial mobilization patterns, production capacity studies he had conducted during his time in the United States, and realistic assessments of how quickly American factories could convert to military production. Yamamoto understood that Japan's initial advantage would lie in its battle-ready military forces, experienced pilots, and strategic positioning. The Imperial Japanese Navy possessed highly trained personnel, technically sophisticated aircraft, and excellent tactical doctrine. For the first months of any conflict, these advantages would be decisive. Japanese carriers would dominate the Pacific. Japanese pilots would control the skies, and Japanese forces would seize territory across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. But Yamamoto knew this window would close rapidly, not because American forces would fight more bravely or possess superior tactics, but because American factories would simply overwhelm Japan with sheer volume of production. His calculations were precise and terrifying. Once fully mobilized, American shipyards could construct more aircraft carriers in a year than Japan could build in a decade. American aircraft factories could produce more fighters and bombers in months than Japanese industry could manufacture annually. American steel production could support simultaneous major offensives in both the Pacific and European theaters, while Japanese steel production struggled to maintain a single theater operation. The mathematics were inexorable, and Yamamoto had learned long ago that mathematics didn't care about warrior spirit, national honor, or military tradition. By 1939, Yamamoto had been appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, the highest operational command in the Imperial Japanese Navy. This position gave him ultimate responsibility for naval strategy and operations, but it also placed him in an impossible situation. He opposed war with America, yet was expected to plan for exactly such a conflict. He understood Japan would lose a prolonged war, yet was ordered to develop strategies for victory. He had warned repeatedly about American industrial capacity, yet was tasked with overcoming that very capacity through tactical brilliance. The contradiction would define the remainder of his career and ultimately his legacy. 1940. Europe burned as Nazi Germany swept across the continent, and Japan aligned itself increasingly with the Axis powers through the Tripartite Pact. Yamamoto watched these developments with deep foreboding, understanding that Japan was binding itself to a coalition that would inevitably bring it into conflict with the United States. His position had become acutely paradoxical. He was now responsible for planning a war he believed Japan could not win, against a nation whose industrial might he had witnessed firsthand, in service of a strategy he considered fundamentally doomed. During this period, Yamamoto began developing the operational plan that would become the attack on Pearl Harbor. The irony was profound. The admiral who most strongly opposed war with America was designing the strike that would ensure such a war occurred. But Yamamoto's thinking was grimly logical. If war became unavoidable, Japan's only hope lay in delivering such a devastating initial blow that America might seek negotiated peace rather than total victory. The plan wasn't optimistic, it was desperate, a calculated gamble based on the hope that American resolve might crack under a catastrophic surprise attack. The Pearl Harbor plan reflected Yamamoto's understanding of both American industrial capacity and American psychology. He knew the attack would need to be overwhelming, targeting the Pacific Fleet's battleships to buy Japan the 6 months to a year he had predicted. During that window, Japanese forces would seize oil resources in the Dutch East Indies, rubber plantations in Malaya, and defensive perimeter islands across the Pacific. These conquests would hopefully create a situation where reconquering them would seem too costly for America to attempt, leading to negotiated settlement that recognized Japan's new territorial gains. Historical records from the Japanese Naval General Staff, referenced in numerous scholarly works including Samuel Eliot Morrison's History of U.S. Naval Operations in World War II, document the intense debates over Yamamoto's plan. Many senior officers considered it too risky, too dependent on surprise, and too likely to unite American public opinion for war rather than divide it. Yamamoto acknowledged these risks, but argued that conventional strategy offered even less chance of success. A traditional war of attrition would simply allow American industrial superiority to grind Japan down over years rather than months. The surprise attack at least offered the possibility of shocking America into negotiations rather than mobilization. Yet even as he refined the Pearl Harbor operation throughout 1940 and into 1941, Yamamoto continued warning civilian leaders about the ultimate futility of war with America. Prime Minister Prince Fumimaro Konoe reportedly asked Yamamoto directly about Japan's chances in a conflict with the United States. The admiral's response was characteristically blunt. He could guarantee results for 6 months, but could promise nothing beyond that. If the war extended beyond a year, he expected only disaster. The factories he had toured in Detroit, the steel mills in Pittsburgh, the shipyards along both American coasts, all would become unstoppable engines of military production that would overwhelm anything Japan could field. 19th October, 1941. General Hideki Tojo became Prime Minister of Japan, replacing the more moderate Konoe and effectively ending diplomatic efforts to avoid war with the United States. Yamamoto understood the significance immediately. The military factions that had never witnessed American industrial power, that had never toured Ford's factories or calculated the production differentials, now controlled Japan's destiny completely. The admiral's warnings had failed to prevent the catastrophe he had predicted for over a decade. War was now inevitable, and he would be responsible for its opening phase. The final weeks before Pearl Harbor found Yamamoto simultaneously perfecting his attack plan while making last-minute attempts to communicate the dangers of prolonged conflict. He met with political leaders, spoke to military colleagues, and wrote letters expressing his grave concerns about Japan's strategic position. According to accounts preserved in Japanese military archives and documented by historians including Hiroyuki Agawa in his comprehensive biography of Yamamoto, the admiral used increasingly stark language during this period, describing the coming conflict as potentially suicidal for Japan if it extended beyond the initial offensive phase. Yamamoto's pessimism was rooted in updated calculations about American industrial capacity. By 1941, he had received intelligence reports about American rearmament efforts following the outbreak of war in Europe. The reports confirmed his worst fears. American factories were already beginning to convert to military production, shipyards were expanding, and the government was implementing mobilization plans that would dwarf anything Japan could attempt. The Ford River Rouge complex alone, the facility he had toured 16 years earlier, was preparing to manufacture B-24 Liberator bombers at a rate that would exceed Japan's entire annual aircraft production. One factory, one type of aircraft, outnumbering Japan's total output. The arithmetic of doom became even clearer as November 1941 progressed. Japan produced approximately 7,000 aircraft annually across all types: fighters, bombers, reconnaissance planes. American plans called for producing over 50,000 aircraft in 1942 alone, increasing to 96,000 in 1943. Japan's shipyards could launch perhaps 200,000 tons of naval vessels annually under maximum wartime production. American shipyards were preparing to launch over 2 million tons annually. Japan's oil imports, already restricted by American embargo, totaled roughly 5 million barrels per year. America produced over 1.3 billion barrels annually from domestic sources alone. The ratios weren't just unfavorable, they were apocalyptic. On 26 November 1941, the Pearl Harbor Strike Force departed Japanese waters under strict radio silence, steaming toward Hawaii, while last-minute diplomatic negotiations continued in Washington. Yamamoto remained at naval headquarters in Tokyo, knowing that within days his carefully planned operation would either achieve devastating success or fail catastrophically. But success and failure had become relative concepts for the admiral. Even perfect execution of the Pearl Harbor attack would only buy the 6 months he had promised. Beyond that window, American industrial might would begin crushing Japan under the weight of mass-produced tanks, aircraft, ships, and munitions that Japanese factories simply could not match. 7th December 1941. The date that would live in infamy began with Yamamoto's worst nightmare becoming reality. Not the success of the Pearl Harbor attack itself, which achieved devastating tactical results, but the strategic consequence that followed. The strike force sank or damaged 8 American battleships, destroyed over 180 aircraft, and killed more than 2,400 American servicemen. Tactically, the operation exceeded its objectives. Strategically, it accomplished exactly what Yamamoto had feared most. It unified American public opinion for total war rather than negotiated peace. The admiral received reports of the attack's success with grim satisfaction, mixed with deep foreboding. His forces had achieved surprise, his pilots had performed brilliantly, and American naval power in the Pacific had been temporarily crippled. The 6-month window had begun. But Yamamoto understood immediately that the attack had failed in its ultimate objective. Instead of shocking America into seeking peace terms, it had awakened the sleeping giant he had warned about for over 15 years. The factories of Detroit, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and 1,000 other American cities would now mobilize for total war, and their productive capacity would eventually overwhelm Japan, regardless of tactical victories or fighting spirit. The first 6 months of the Pacific War proceeded largely as Yamamoto had predicted. Japanese forces swept across Southeast Asia and the Pacific with stunning speed, seizing Singapore, Hong Kong, the Philippines, Wake Island, Guam, the Dutch East Indies, and numerous other territories. The conquests provided access to oil, rubber, and other strategic resources Japan desperately needed. Japanese carrier forces dominated Pacific waters, Japanese pilots controlled the skies, and Japanese tactical prowess repeatedly defeated larger Allied forces. The war was proceeding exactly according to plan, which made Yamamoto increasingly anxious, because he knew the plan only worked for 6 months. Early June, 1942. The Battle of Midway marked the precise end of Yamamoto's predicted timeline. Approximately 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japanese and American carrier forces clashed near Midway Atoll in the Central Pacific. Yamamoto commanded the operation personally, committing virtually Japan's entire carrier strength to the battle. The result was catastrophic. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and thousands of experienced pilots in a single day. American forces, though outnumbered, achieved decisive victory through superior intelligence, tactical luck, and the first fruits of American industrial mobilization: newer aircraft, better equipment, and replacement pilots that Japan could never match. According to military historians, including John Keegan, in his analysis of World War II naval operations, Midway represented not just a tactical defeat, but the fulfillment of Yamamoto's prophecy. The 6-month window had closed. Japanese offensive capability had reached its peak and begun declining. Meanwhile, American industrial production was accelerating toward levels that would have seemed impossible to planners who hadn't toured Ford's factories. The shipyards Yamamoto remembered from his 1920s visits were now launching escort carriers at a rate of 1 per week, producing Liberty ships faster than German U-boats could sink them, and constructing Essex-class fleet carriers that individually outweighed Japan's entire annual ship production. The mathematics Yamamoto had calculated 15 years earlier in Detroit were now playing out across the Pacific battlefield with inexorable precision. Late 1942 into early 1943. Yamamoto watched as American industrial production transformed from potential threat into overwhelming reality. Intelligence reports flowing into combined fleet headquarters documented American manufacturing output that exceeded even his pessimistic calculations. The Ford Willow Run plant, built on farmland near the River Rouge complex Yamamoto had toured decades earlier, was producing B-24 bombers at a rate of 1 aircraft per hour. 1 plant, 1 hour. The assembly line techniques Henry Ford had pioneered for automobiles were now manufacturing heavy bombers faster than Japan could repair damaged aircraft. The Admiral's staff compiled production figures that read like strategic death sentences. American shipyards launched more tonnage in a single month than Japan's entire merchant marine. American aircraft factories produced more fighters in a quarter than Japan manufactured annually. American tank plants rolled out Shermans so rapidly that commanders could afford to accept higher loss rates because replacements arrived faster than losses accumulated. The war had become exactly what Yamamoto feared, an industrial competition that Japan could never win, a contest decided not by tactical brilliance or warrior spirit, but by production capacity and resource abundance. Guadalcanal became the grinding attritional campaign that proved Yamamoto's thesis. From August 1942 through February 1943, Japanese and American forces fought for control of a strategically vital island in the Solomon Chain. Japan committed extensive naval and air resources to the campaign, achieving numerous tactical victories, but slowly losing the war of attrition. For every American aircraft shot down, 2 more arrived as replacements. For every American ship sunk, 3 more appeared on the horizon. Japanese losses, equally heavy, could not be replaced at anywhere near the same rate. Experienced pilots died and were replaced by inadequately trained recruits. Damaged warships languished in dockyards awaiting repairs that strained Japan's limited industrial capacity. By early 1943, Yamamoto recognized that Japan faced a deteriorating strategic position from which recovery was impossible. The defensive perimeter established during the first 6 months of war was beginning to crack under pressure from American forces that grew stronger monthly, while Japanese forces grew weaker. The oil from the Dutch East Indies, the rubber from Malaya, the strategic resources that conquest was supposed to provide, all were increasingly difficult to transport to Japan as American submarines interdicted shipping lanes and American air power dominated critical choke points. Japan was slowly being strangled by the industrial colossus Yamamoto had warned about since the 1920s. Historical accounts document that Yamamoto became increasingly fatalistic during this period, according to staff officers who served with him. He continued planning operations and directing naval strategy, but his earlier confidence had vanished completely. In private conversations, he reportedly expressed the view that Japan had already lost the war. The remaining question was merely how long defeat would take and how devastating it would become. The factories of Detroit had won. The outcome was now simply playing out across the Pacific battlefield. 18th April, 1943. American intelligence intercepted and decoded Japanese naval communications revealing that Admiral Yamamoto would be flying to inspect forward bases in the Solomon Islands. The information reached Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of Pacific Forces, who faced a difficult decision. Assassinating a military commander during an inspection flight was ethically questionable, but eliminating Japan's most talented naval strategist offered significant military advantages. After consulting with Washington, Nimitz authorized an interception mission. Long-range P-38 Lightning fighters from Guadalcanal would ambush Yamamoto's transport aircraft over Bougainville. The morning of 18th April dawned clear over the South Pacific. Yamamoto departed Rabaul aboard a Mitsubishi G4M bomber, escorted by 0 fighters, on a precisely scheduled inspection flight. American P-38s, having flown over 400 miles at wave-top height to avoid detection, arrived at the interception point exactly as calculated. The engagement lasted only minutes. American fighters shot down Yamamoto's aircraft, which crashed into the jungle below. The admiral, who had warned Japan against war with America, who had predicted his nation would have only 6 months of success, who had toured Detroit's factories and understood the true arithmetic of industrial warfare, died approximately 16 months after Pearl Harbor. His prophecy fulfilled, his warnings ignored, his nation committed to a catastrophic conflict he had opposed from the beginning. News of Yamamoto's death, kept secret for weeks to maintain Japanese morale, devastated the Imperial Japanese Navy. Beyond his strategic abilities and tactical brilliance, Yamamoto had been the one senior leader who truly understood American industrial capacity. His replacement commanders, many of whom had never visited the United States, continued fighting the war with tactical focus, but without Yamamoto's sobering understanding of the strategic impossibility of their position. The war continued for over 2 more years, but the outcome Yamamoto had predicted was never in doubt after the first 6 months. The factories Yamamoto toured in the 1920s became the arsenals that destroyed Imperial Japan. Ford's River Rouge complex and Willow Run plant produced thousands of bombers and tanks. American shipyards launched over 5,000 warships during the war. Aircraft factories manufactured nearly 300,000 military aircraft. Steel mills produced over 87 million tons in 1944 alone, more than Japan produced during the entire war. The productive capacity Yamamoto witnessed firsthand during his American posting became the overwhelming force that crushed Japanese military power through sheer volume of production. In retrospect, Yamamoto's career embodied tragic irony. He was the admiral who understood America too well, who opposed war yet planned Pearl Harbor, who predicted 6 months of success yet was proven correct to within weeks, who warned repeatedly about industrial capacity yet was ignored by military planners who never toured Ford's factories. His story illustrates how personal experience, walking through Detroit assembly lines, witnessing American abundance, calculating production ratios, can provide strategic insights that theoretical knowledge cannot match. Yamamoto saw the future of modern warfare in Henry Ford's factories in 1925, understood that industrial capacity would determine victory in any major conflict, and spent the rest of his career warning that Japan was embarking on a war it could not win. The admiral's prophecy, 6 months of success, nothing guaranteed beyond, proved devastatingly accurate. His legacy remains complex. Brilliant strategist, reluctant warrior, prophet without honor in his own nation, a man who understood his enemy too well to believe in victory, yet served his country faithfully unto death. The assembly lines of Detroit that amazed him in the 1920s eventually produced the arsenal that fulfilled his darkest predictions. Yamamoto's story stands as historical testament to the decisive importance of industrial power in modern warfare and the tragic fate of prophets whose warnings go unheeded.